Good evening and welcome everyone. My name is Joseph Paterica and I'm the CEO of Kalbar Operations Pty Limited. I will be your moderator for this evening. Before we begin, I want to respectfully acknowledge the Gunai people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting. I pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and honour their ongoing cultural and spiritual connections to this country. We are meeting on the lands of the Brabralung people, one of the 5 clans of the Gunai Nation. Before we commence this evening's EES Specialist Studies Q&A, I will explain how tonight's live streaming session will work. In September, we sought questions, comments and feedback from the community on the EES for the Fingerboards Mineral Sands project, which is currently on public exhibition. The EES presents potential positive and negative impacts of the Fingerboards project. We have received questions specifically in response to our expression of interest for tonight's webinar, and we have also received many other questions about the EES during the public exhibition period. From the feedback received, we have determined the key topics for tonight's webinar and the relevant specialist to present and answer questions. Those topics are biodiversity and vegetation removal, grassy woodland restoration, and surface water management. Each of the 3 specialists will give a presentation, then answer any pre-submitted questions relevant to their topic. Questions can be submitted during the webinar through the online screen link, which is now visible on your screen. We have a team ready to receive your questions, so please send them through. The questions will not appear on your screen. I will read out the questions and they will be answered by the relevant specialists. If we receive questions on EES topics other than those presented this evening, we will try to answer them if time permits. All questions received will be answered and published in a Q&A document uploaded to the Fingerboards website within 7 days. This is the agenda for tonight's proceedings. 20 minutes have been allocated per topic, 10 minutes for each presentation, followed by 10 minutes for questions and answers. When introducing each agenda item, the topic will be in bold, as well as the technical expert's name. I now introduce Aaron Organ to present on biodiversity and vegetation removal.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks everyone for coming along tonight. For those who haven't heard me present previously, I'll go through some information that I've presented previously at the last webinar and also the community consultation meeting that was held leading up to the release of the EES. So I'll present on the key methods, findings and outcomes of our investigations that have been going now for coming on probably 4.5 years. So thanks again for the opportunity to present tonight. So for those who aren't familiar with the EES process, it's pretty important that when the referral was submitted and then the government came back and the minister determined that an EES is required, it outlined a couple of key principles and objectives that need to be addressed as part of our biodiversity assessments. I won't go through each of those dot points, but essentially it was to do a detailed risk assessment, document the ecological values across the project area and beyond, and then looking at key matters of environmental significance, both on the state level, so under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act, and then on the Commonwealth level as well, so under the Biodiversity Conservation, so EPBC Act, Environment, Biodiversity and Conservation Act. Key things as part of the scoping requirement was to look at the direct impacts, what mitigation measures were going to be applied or proposed, and then also looking at the residual impacts and associated significance of those impacts. So as part of our work, like I said, over the last few years, it involved fairly extensive surveys across the project area, looking at the mine footprint. the infrastructure layout, and other areas where it was likely to be disturbance associated with the project. So we've spent multiple survey seasons across doing surveys across the site, along roadsides as well, and also as part of that, the initial surveys that informed where detailed surveys need to be undertaken for specific species of concern or consideration. So we undertook detailed targeted surveys, one species of which is the gaping leek orchid along the Gippsland railway line, and other threatened flora species. So they were undertaken based on the survey requirements that are outlined in the Commonwealth guidelines and also under the state requirements. It's really important to note that the process that we've gone through has been very, very rigorous, where we've had constant feedback from the technical reference group, where they've had input. So DELP, the Catchment Management Authority, and other agencies to inform the extent, location, and the type of surveys undertaken across the project area. We also undertook detailed fauna investigations, so looking at diurnal bird surveys, detailed herpetological surveys, undertook spotlighting over a number of nights, again for arboreal mammals, for certain owl species, stag watching, call playback, and bat surveys which detect bats, and then also remote camera surveys over multiple seasons and years. We also undertook targeted surveys for a number of threatened species. So for the Australian grayling, there's one species, the giant burrowing frog, which is fairly suboptimal habitat in the gullies, but we nevertheless did detailed targeted surveys for that species, and other species would have certainly been targeted for, like greater glider and other species that are known to occur in higher quality remnants throughout the local area. I won't go into too much detail. I'm sure that you've had the opportunity to read our technical report and also the EES that's currently available. So that we've recorded a large number of flora species and terrestrial fauna species across the project area, mapped over 200 hectares of vegetation, so native vegetation, 11 ecological vegetation classes, and in a large number of large trees in patches and also scattered trees. So as part of our methodology, we look at not only large trees, which is a certain diameter breast height that we record for associated with each EVC, but also looking at scattered trees and the importance of those trees, particularly whether or not they had or supported hollows. So as part of our surveys, we recorded a number of state significant flora species. They were principally recorded in areas or patches of native vegetation. So if you've had a chance to download the technical document, there's a series of figures in there that actually show you where the location of those state significant flora species are located and the total number and the potential or likely impact on those species. We also undertook targeted surveys for 3 nationally significant species, which I mentioned, the gaping leek orchid, but there's also the other 2 there, and potentially other nationally threatened species that were highlighted by DELP. With respect to fauna, so looking at terrestrial fauna here, we also, like I said, undertook a detailed aquatic survey across the site. But with the fauna surveys, we recorded the nationally significant grey-headed flying fox. So many of you would know that there's a existing colony out in Bairnsdale, so that's the campsite. So the one individual that we recorded as part of our surveys was flying across the site. Individuals may temporarily, periodically reside within the study area, feeding on eucalypt blossoms. We also recorded yellow-bellied sheath-tailed bat. And then there's potential habitat, albeit low likelihood, for swift parrot, painted honeyeater, dwarf galaxus, and like I said before, giant burrowing frog, which is pretty suboptimal habitat, but we undertook detailed surveys for that species. We didn't record any of those other nationally threatened bird species. So the swift parrot and painted honeyeater, there is a potential, albeit low, that they could, small numbers could visit the site on occasions, but that would be vagrant visitors to the site. I thought I'd include this in the slide. So this just gives you a bit of context around the key areas that we surveyed and the areas that are subject to the proposed mine. So you see there's a number of gullies there and a patch of vegetation out to the west of the site. So those indicated or shown in the red areas. But you look at that compared to, say, up northeast of the site, beyond the project area, where it's subject, obviously, to intensive agriculture with the food production area. Then you've got larger patches of remnant native vegetation to the south and also to the west of the site, which is indicated by the blue areas. So they're quite large, consolidated, high-quality areas for a range of flora and fauna species of significance. So that gives you a bit of context around the project area and the extent of native vegetation and habitat that's available. There's just a few photos of the camera traps. So obviously foxes are fairly common throughout the landscape. And then the other species we've recorded as part of those camera traps, which it's always good to download the data and see what species you get on those photos. There's a few photos of the habitat types, a number of wetlands, dams. There's a plantation down in the bottom right-hand corner, and then large remnant trees and scatter trees. So those two photos up the top, it's typical of a lot of areas across the project area where it's quite a modified understory and a shrub layer that's been absent or is absent. And that's largely due to current grazing pressures and threatening processes associated with existing use. So as outlined in our technical document, and which has been outlined in the relevant chapter of the EES, the proposed mine and associated works will result in or propose to remove up to 160 hectares of native vegetation and a number of large scattered trees. It's important to note that we've done a fairly detailed assessment to look at the overall quality of those patches. So again, just making that distinction between the area versus the quality of vegetation. There's one nationally listed community, so 1.74 hectares of the Gippsland River Red Gum Grassy Woodland community, and then the 14.5 hectares of the Forest Red Gum community, which will propose to be impacted, and then a range of other species which I mentioned earlier. So one of the critical things as part of a project like this, of this size, is to clearly demonstrate avoidance. So it's a requirement under the Commonwealth process and also under the state government, under the guidelines, so 5217 of the planning scheme, which is the native vegetation clearing regulation. So under the guidelines, there's a key requirement to avoid native vegetation, minimise those losses, and then obviously the last step of that mitigation hierarchy is to look for relevant offsets to compensate for any permitted removal of native vegetation. So there's a number of steps taken, and there's still, I believe, ongoing discussions to look at where further avoidance of removal of biodiversity values can be achieved. So I won't go through each one of those, but that's been clearly outlined in the relevant documents in our report and also in the EES. And then when avoidance is achieved, there's obviously ongoing opportunities which will be relevant to the environmental management framework and the relevant sub-plan. So there will be a range of requirements placed on this project if indeed it is approved, where it will involve a number of environmental plans that will relate to avoiding and minimising further loss of native vegetation and biodiversity values. So pre-clearance surveys, flora and fauna salvage translocation, water quality monitoring, groundwater dependent ecosystem monitoring, reinstatement of habitat. So there'll be ongoing requirement for that reinstatement and potentially improvement in biodiversity values over time, given that this project will go for a number of years. It's not as if day one the whole area will be completely disturbed. There's opportunities to progressively rehabilitate areas as you go along, which Paul will talk to in a minute. And just finally, last slide here is a number of sub-plans which I mentioned. So the offset management plan. So we've provided an offset management strategy that looks at both the Commonwealth and the state requirements. So many of you may know that under the native vegetation guidelines, there's a requirement for offsets. this project will involve a number of species habitat units, environmental management, construction environmental management plan, biodiversity management plan, and rehabilitation plan, which are all part of that post-approval requirement, which will be placed on Kalbar should approval be given. There'll be fairly strict requirements to ensure that those things are implemented.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks for your presentation. So we'll just move on to the questions now for yourself, Aaron. So we do have a couple that have come in. So the first one I'll read out relates to light pollution. As your planned operation will be 24/7, there'll be light pollution. How will you mitigate against this impact to ecosystems?
That's a good question. So yeah, light pollution is certainly a consideration for potential impacts on fauna. So there's a couple of things to consider as part of that. So there's obviously species are attracted to light. So it could be bats and the like that could be benefit from the increased level of light. And then there's obviously potential negative impacts associated with avoidance of particular areas. So it's really important that as part of that, like I said, post-approval construction process, that lighting is not placed in areas of sensitivity, so around wetlands or areas of native vegetation, and that when light is used, that it's only used for the duration that it's intended for, to minimise any potential impacts to fauna. Yeah, so that's something that will need to be considered as part of that post-approval ongoing monitoring and management of the works as they go along. And yeah, also just making sure that lighting is directed outside of areas of sensitivity. So having shields and other things to prevent that light pollution in areas of sensitivity that I mentioned.
Thanks for that, Aaron. There is another question here, which I'll just read out. I'm concerned about the native flora and fauna along the railway track, and that the rail siding might destroy it.
Yeah, so that's certainly received a lot of consideration and detailed surveys. So the rail siding area it's not actually proposed to be located within the road reserve. There will be access tracks, punching into that road reserve, but the location along, I think it's Cowes Lane, it's quite a narrow area which will be disturbed, and then the actual siding itself will be located in cleared paddocks. So yeah, with very little ecological value. There is obviously a requirement or a consideration around those indirect impacts during operation into those areas along the railway reserve. So the vegetation along the Gippsland Rail Reserve is quite important and quite significant. So it's got the grassy woodland community, the EPBC outlisted community, and also there is a record or records along there for threatened species. So it's something that we've looked at. We've spoken with DELP and we've gone out on site and actually undertaken a fairly comprehensive survey, to a point where we will be going back over the coming months to do further surveys along there, given the seasonality and the temporal nature of flowering of certain species. So it is a consideration. It's the further survey will be undertaken and feed into the management of the project.
Thanks for that, Aaron. I have another question here. Are there any opportunities for the project to improve the ecological values during and after the mining operations, and if so, where and when?
That's a good one. Yeah, look, obviously the environmental effects statements or environmental effects statement emphasises or goes through that risk assessment process, where you look at what the values are and then the impact assessment, and then determine the residual impact. So it's mainly driven around what the impacts are and the significance of impacts. But often for projects, it's really important to, notwithstanding the fact that there will be extensive areas of vegetation and habitat proposed to be removed. So that's quite clear in all the reports. But there's a real opportunity to ensure that there's, and Paul will speak shortly around the restoration project that's proposed. That's certainly going to be a positive thing, given that where that's located is in pine plantations or cleared paddocks. There's definitely opportunities to protect existing native vegetation. And then as part of the offset process, there's a number of properties that will be identified, which will be managed and in perpetuity. So there'll be an overall improvement in the vegetation quality, and the threatening processes on that land or different properties will essentially be managed. So there's a real opportunity to enhance the values, and then ultimately over time, there's my understanding is that there's a requirement as part of that restoration process to restore things as much as possible. Obviously, it takes time. You can't replicate things, and things don't happen overnight, particularly in areas where you've got large trees that take many years to develop. So certainly there are opportunities to enhance the ecological values, particularly as part of that offset process and also the restoration.
Thank you, Aaron. Look, I just have one more question. So we've read the EES and biodiversity technical report, and we are aware of the offset requirements for the project. Are you able to provide an update on the biodiversity offset process, particularly how and when the project will meet the offset requirements for the proposed removal of native vegetation under the Commonwealth EPBC Act and the State Native Vegetation Guidelines?
Yeah, so I think that was a question that was raised previously. But certainly, if there's any approval of the project, obviously it needs to go through the assessment process, and then having that decision come down, there is a requirement to look at the offsets, which I mentioned, on the Commonwealth, on the state level. My understanding is that they're ongoing, so we've been undertaking detailed desktop analysis of multiple properties, and Kalbar will continue liaising and negotiating and speaking with relevant landowners. So that'll happen over time. I believe there's been multiple properties that are had ground assessments undertaken, and then further discussion around the suitability of those and eligibility of those sites will occur. So that's an ongoing process that will lead into the panel inquiry or panel hearing in the new year.
Thank you for that, Aaron. Look, there's no further questions, but if more do come through, we'll certainly either cover them off if we've got more time at the end, or we'll have them as part of the Q&A that we'll publish within 7 days. So,
thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. Okay, I'll now move on to introducing our next speaker, who is Dr. Paul Gibson-Roy, and he'll present on the grassy woodland restoration.
Thank you, Joseph. Okay. And thanks again for that opportunity, and thank you, Aaron, for a really good overview of some of the things that are going to link into my presentation. So what I am proposing to do today, because we've spoken at several community events, community forums, and a range of other venues where we've talked about our larger rehab plans, and there's certainly people may have read the rehabilitation report in the EES. I recommend you have a look at that if you're interested in the whole project in terms of rehab. But what I'll talk to tonight is really focusing on our grassy woodland restoration, and also the other components of the restoration program that encompass native vegetation. So I really would like to sort of talk in the next 10 minutes about what our broad goals are for our native restoration, and then really touch on some of the progress that we've made to date. So there has been, even though we're going through the EES process at the moment, there's a lot of work that goes into preparing and getting not just an EES process ready, but all the information for an EES, but actually making sure that you're ready to do rehab if and when the mine receives approval. So touching on some of our broad goals, and our prime goal is really to restore 200 hectares, potentially more, of species-rich red gum grassy woodland to our post-mine landform. And that will be undertaken in an area which is currently degraded blue gum plantation. So essentially taking an area that was highly modified, is now degraded due to past fire events, and returning that to a native ecological community, which is consistent with the one described in that region. As a part of that, we're really keen to look at trying to reintroduce locally threatened species. We're talking here about flora species at this point in time. So we're really looking at saying, well, you know, are there rare or threatened local plant species that we might be able to incorporate into that restoration program? Another component of that, because vegetation itself essentially creates the framework, the habitat for all the fauna species. So essentially we're aiming for something much more holistic than, you know, some grasses or some wildflowers or some trees. We want this to be a part of a whole community that has plants and animals in it, and fungi and all sorts of other things. So we're looking to undertake faunal mitigation works and landscape augmentation. So the sort of things, you know, we're talking about there are creating habitat for fauna. That might be vegetation in its own right, particular types of vegetation, using wood material to create stags, creating hollows or nest boxes, so a whole range of mitigation measures within our rehab that could be used by recolonising species. And also we would like to entertain the potential of actually reintroducing species back into the restoration. Again, when you're talking about something that's 200 hectares in scale, that really gives you an opportunity to talk seriously about reintroductions. Another part, which is sort of side to the native grassy woodland, 200 hectares, but still will be very important, is that on our realigned road verges, which potentially could come to 30 hectares of road verge, what we're aiming to recreate are very attractive sweeps of wildflower meadows, so lots of wildflowers, low biomass grasses, so that there's a lower fuel risk, lower management risks, but high diversity, so biodiversity for insects and things like that, but essentially something that looks very attractive, so a high amenity for people passing through that area. We're also outside the plateau areas that we're recreating grazing land. So essentially 700 hectares will go back to grazing pasture. But on the slopes and gullies, we're going to fence those off and restore at much higher tree and shrub densities, native vegetation in that to increase habitat for fauna and also to improve the soil stabilisation. Now, a key component of all this, because seed is very, very rare in the region. It's very sparse, and I'll talk about that why in a minute, is we're going to establish a seed production capacity, and from that we're able to increase or grow seed, which from a whole range of species, which will be used to provide the bulk of the seed that we're using in our restoration project. So we're aiming to restore a 15-hectare seed production facility. In terms of Australian seed production facilities, that would be very much at the large end, and that will create a lot of expertise and infrastructure, you know, for the local region. And then finally, as you know, encompassing all those sort of things that I've just spoken about, we hope that this creates opportunities for community to become involved through education and training and engagement. So there are overall goals. So Anthony, thanks. If you could move on to the next slide, please. Okay, so why are we trying to restore the red gum grassy woodland? Well, the Gippsland red gum grassy woodland communities and associated grasslands are an ecological vegetation class that have been defined as a distinct community which is endemic to the Gippsland Plain. So it's a regional community which has been identified by scientists and ecologists, and then through the Department of or DELP. And it was once quite extensive across the Gippsland Plains, and as you can see on that lower slide, I've just created a sort of an outline of where it was once extensive. You can see that historically, since European settlement, it's been extensively cleared. This is highly productive agricultural land, and so this is why that community now is a nationally threatened plant community. Most of it has been removed. So that's our great impetus to try and say, okay, well, here's an opportunity after the mining is complete. Here's a great opportunity for us to actually restore and put back a very large chunk of that particular plant community. Thanks, Anthony. So what do these things look like? Well, in many ways, open grassy woodlands look very similar in many ways to a typical, typical pasture scenario. So you've got a sparse, large tree with a grassy understory, except that the grassy understory in a native grassy woodland is essentially all native species. You've got large trees spreading, low densities, maybe 30 to 50 large trees per hectare. You do have shrubs in there, but they're not very common, they're not very dense, they might be in small patches. Essentially, it's a herbaceous understory. So when I say herbaceous, I'm talking grasses and wildflowers. And you can see on a couple of those slides, where there's a lot of wildflower diversity, they can be extremely attractive. Lots of wildflowers, daisies, lilies, and things like that. So they're the sort of communities in those examples there that we're trying to recreate in our project here. Thanks, Anthony. Next slide, please. So yes, you can see a schematic there of the proposed mine footprint, and we've just broken down there. You can see the slightly different colorations. They're defining what we're calling the different rehabilitation domains. So the khaki area, sort of to the centre and slightly to the left, that's going to be the native grassy woodland restoration zone. So if you're wondering where that will be, that's where it is, and essentially now is the blue gum plantation. The lighter areas around that will go back, the plateau areas, the flatter areas to pasture grazing, and those darker greens will be the areas we spoke about that are going back to native vegetation at higher tree and shrub densities for habitat and soil stabilisation. And then the red lines are the realigned road surfaces, where again, this wonderful opportunity to put lots of colour and movement and biodiversity back into our local road. Thank you, Anthony. So what have we done? I'll start to talk about what we've been doing in the last 12 to 18 months. So we've in consultation with local specialists, with people from DELP, people like Aaron, ecologists, looking at EVC documentation, looking at herbarium records. We've really developed a list of species that we would like to bring into this restoration project. It's a very long list. We're looking at overall all the native species together, up over 300 species. So we've in consultation with DELP, got seed collection permits. We've gone to local collectors, local specialists in the region, and we've undertaken one season of seed collection, where we've gone out to the field looking for these species off these long lists, taking very small amounts of seed from the wild, again, because we don't want to take a lot from the wild because it is so rare, and we're trying to bring that back into cultivation. And I'm very pleased to say that we've collected at least 110 species at this point in time, and you can see there that breakdown of the different types of species there: climbers, wildflowers, grasses, ground covers, trees and shrubs. So quite a wide selection. So a team of people have been working very astutely over these last 18 months to pull together these species lists. Thanks, Anthony. And with that seed, and again, just some slides just to give you an indication, both, you can see just how lovely these species are, these beautiful little wildflowers. Again, many people rarely, if ever, see these sorts of things. And again, they would have once been quite widespread across the region. So we're going out, taking small amounts of seed from these wonderful little grasses and forbs and, trees and shrubs, of course, as well. You can see there, it's generally speaking, small collections. There's a slightly, a little pile there of a native grass, but again, some of the native grasses are much more common. So we're taking that seed, we're processing it, we're drying it, we're collecting all the data on it, and then we're going to use that seed to propagate plants for seed production. Thanks, Anthony. To the next slide. again, in consultation with local specialists, local growers, we've got that seed that we've collected, taken that to growers, and we've begun to propagate large numbers of plants. Now, these plants aren't going directly into the restoration. Of course, the mine, it still has yet to be approved. That has to be decided. But what we're doing is we're already undertaking these sort of works because we need to do this now to have any hope of, really catching up and doing the sort of scales that we're talking about. So we have tens of thousands of plants already propagated. And you can see there that we've got facilities. We're working with these people to grow a whole range of species which aren't normally propagated for restoration. Thanks, Anthony. We'll go to the next slide. And then to a separate process, we've gone and we've located what was a disused facility that was historically used as a wholesale plant nursery, and then we've completely modified that. So just these slides give you an indication of some of the things we've been doing. We've been setting up infrastructure, developing benches, improving the soil, adding organic material, creating growing areas. So a whole range of activity has been going on in the background. That's encompassed, again, local specialists, people from further afield. But again, it's been a real joint effort. Thanks, Anthony. And these next couple of slides just give you an indication of where we've progressed. So that top left-hand slide is an area within that plant nursery that I spoke about. Again, you can see there that all that infrastructure is degraded over time. Essentially, it's just a grassy area with a bit of infrastructure associated with it. We've cleared that. We've modified the soils. We've developed plans where the beds will go, where species will go. You can see there that we've laid down material for the plants to go in. We've created barriers. Thank you, Anthony. If you could go to the next slide. And you can see in this next slide, I think from that slide, if you can remember the one before where it was just a grassy paddock, essentially now it's been completely transformed into an area which is specifically set up to grow plants for seed. So each of those long areas is a bed for a crop. It's irrigated, we can grow those crops in the absence of weeds. We can add water where it's needed. We can harvest that seed very effectively. So it's purpose-built for growing seed. Thanks, Anthony. The next slide that's coming up shows a completely separate area. So again, in the top left-hand side, you can see essentially just very basic infrastructure, some, boundary material, just a grassy area that was once, covered with crushed rock and plants in pots on it. We've cleared that. We've improved the soil. We've added organic material. We've laid irrigation. We've got quite an extensive plan where we know we want to grow wildflower A, B, C, and D. In certain sort of patterns, whether it's on the ground or up on trellis. And all those plants that I spoke about earlier and showed, those plants now will begin to go into those beds. So as I speak, or this week, we've got the weed mat going down there, and crews are getting ready to start putting the plants back into those areas. Thanks, Anthony. So there's a whole range of other things that have been going on. So obviously, the restoration project is based on examples of other work done in other locations, both in Victoria and elsewhere, at different scales, essentially mostly small. But wherever you do these sort of things, there are site-specific knowledge gaps that you really need to understand. So we've been doing other extensive investigations into things like what is the soil seed bank like on the mine site? So we've sampled extensively across the site, the soil seed bank, down through the profile of the soil, and we've taken those back to a nursery and we're growing on those samples. And from that, we've been able to determine where the weeds are at different points on that property and how deep they go. And that's very important, that information. It will inform how we treat the soils in the restoration. We've done very similar work across the nutrient characteristics, the carbon, the organic material. We've been setting up experimentations to look at how we might modify those soils to create more suitable soils for growing native plants. So how do we retain the moisture? How do we restrict weed loads? How do we add organic material? So there's been a whole range of activity going on over the last 18 months to try and fill some of those key knowledge gaps. Thanks, Anthony. So altogether, what we've been doing in the last 18 months, all the planning we've been doing, what we've been presenting as a part of the EES process is to say that what we hope to achieve in the long term over the next 15 to 20 years of progressive mining. So we've got that opportunity to do, you know, relatively discrete areas each year to learn and enhance and improve what we do as we go. But essentially those images you can see there are all examples of restored grasslands and grassy woodlands. And all those are incredibly high quality grassy woodlands. In fact, two of those slides, I was a bit cheeky. Two of those slides were on an earlier slide where I was talking about grassy woodlands in general. And in fact, the best restored grassy woodlands and grasslands in some ways are so good that people who don't know any different how they got there would be, you know, mistaken for thinking, okay, well, these have always been here. So when you get these things right, there is the potential to really do some great work here. And what we're hoping to do is that all these sites are very important, but up to date in Australia, they've all been done at relatively small scale, so up to about 15 hectares. So if you can imagine all those images sort of pushed together and expanded out over 200 hectares, and again, that's what we're really aiming to do, both through the company, but again, in conjunction and collaboration with the broader Gippsland community, to make this a project that we're all really proud of, to restore biodiversity and enhance our appreciation of nature in the region. So Anthony, thank you very much. Joseph, that's the end of my presentation.
Thanks for that, Paul. Look, I've got a few good questions that have come through. I'll start with the first one here. Please provide the following details for the proposed Plains grassy woodland restoration. And there's a few, I'll just go through them, Paul. So plant species selection and numbers, age of plants, plan of the layout of the area showing where various species would be located, methods of soil preparation, plant protection from herbivorous, fencing and guarding types.
Right, okay. Thank you, Joseph. Well, that's quite a comprehensive question, and there's a lot of information in that. So I'll just give a sort of an overview of that. It's a very good question. So the species, I've sort of touched on that earlier in the presentation. So really what we're doing there is we've looked at a range of sources which give information about what species you would expect to find in that particular EVC. So we're looking at EVC documents. We've spent a lot of time scrutinising herbarium records from the Royal Botanic Garden in Melbourne, for example, the Atlas of Living Australia, Aaron's document, the biodiversity report that he and his colleagues prepared, created extensive information around what you might expect both at the fingerboard site and joining it, but also in the larger region. So we've looked at those. We've also looked at, books and other material. So from that, we've developed a very large species list and a target. Now, hopefully we can get as many of them over 15 to 20 years. We won't get them all in the first or second years, but again, growing them in production allows us to really build that up. The age of the plants, look, our restoration project, the bulk of that large 200 hectare area will be direct seeded. So the age of the plant question might be more related to typical tree and shrub type planting. And so most of that area will be direct seeded, and those plants will come up as they come up as seedlings. The trees and shrubs that we do put in at much lower densities, 30 to 50 plants, roughly per hectare, it's much easier then to grow them as plants. So we'll go to local propagators and we'll install those plants as plants. Now, clearly we'll guard those using tree guards and things like that. Because our progressive mining is in, discrete areas each year, herbivores are going to be an issue, and that's always an issue in restoration. So we'll be looking at things like temporary fencing, whether that's electric fencing or just other forms of temporary fencing. But overall, at the end of the project, where we have a large, good area of restoration, we may be looking as well about an extensive, surrounding boundary that protects or manages the herbivores, because the last thing you want to do is have this amazing species diversity and then having that decline because it's been overgrazed. I think that answers most of that question, Joseph, but I'm always happy to if people have particular questions about that sort of thing as the project goes on, more than happy to talk to them about it.
No, thanks for answering that, Paul, and we'll make sure we answer that completely with what we post live or what we post on the Q&A for all the questions. But look, I'll just move to the next one, Paul. Sure. What is the largest restoration of this nature you have done elsewhere?
Okay. Well, I've been doing this for 20 odd years, and I've started this as a researcher. So when I started in this area, and there have been a few people who just started tinkering with the idea that maybe we could actually look at restoring grassland. So most of that up until then was all about conservation. Can we conserve grasslands and grassy woodlands? And most people at that time thought restoring them actually wasn't feasible. So when I started again, I was a researcher at Melbourne University. Most of those early plots were very small scale stuff. Over the last 20 years, I've done projects, the largest of which are up 10 to 15 hectares. The bulk of them are in the 1 to 10 hectare size. If you put all the restorations that I've done together, or directly done, there would maybe be 250 to 300 hectares. There are probably about 200 or 300 restorations in that, so there's a lot of work. Now, outside that might not sound like much, but across all of Australia, or southeastern Australia where these communities are, there has been very little restoration done. It's been done extensively overseas, in America, on prairies and things like that, but we really haven't done a lot of it here. So the Fingerboards project is the first opportunity to take all those small-scale learnings that people like myself and others have done, and put all that knowledge and learning together with the budget and commitment from the company to say, let's do something now which represents scales of quantum bigger than what we've done before. So as I said, in answer to that question, lots of small ones together, maybe 200-300 hectares. We're going to double that. We're potentially going to do much larger than that if you put all our native restoration together at the Fingerboards project. So this could be one of the most important restoration projects undertaken in Australia, which again would be lovely to think that all that Gippsland community could have input and something like that to show for.
Yeah, thanks for that, Paul. I'll move on to the next question. Will you do native grassy woodland anywhere else in the rehab other than the planned 200 hectares?
Yeah, okay. Again, I touched on that during the presentation. So certainly along our realigned roads, that will be essentially a grassy woodland structure. It will be more sort of tailored towards high amenities, so lots of wildflowers in it, and low biomass grasses. So again, so it can be easily managed and has a low fuel risk. In the slopes and the gully areas, again, higher tree and shrub densities, but still native grasses and flaxes and things like that underneath. So again, components of those species. So a lot of these species or different EVCs have species which are common across them. Even in our plateau grazing, which we're essentially restoring to grazing pasture, our hope is, if we can get enough seed from our seed production, to incorporate 10 to 15% of native grasses in that. Which would be a really great outcome, because those are very hardy perennial grasses, and what we're hoping to do from that is to improve the strength and resilience of those pastures. And again, there are a lot of organisations in agriculture and now regenerative farming, STIPA, even MLA are very much pushing that concept of trying to incorporate native species, and particularly native grasses, into pasture systems. So over our whole 1,200 hectare restoration project, natives will be essentially right across that.
Thanks, Paul. Look, we've got time for one more question. Can you use your native grassy woodland as an offset? It's a pretty good question.
Yes. Well, look, that's quite a technical one. But look, I shall give it a go. Obviously, Aaron is a real authority on this. But essentially, our native grassy woodland project, it isn't actually proposed that that contributes to the biodiversity offset requirements under the state's native vegetation guidelines. So essentially, we have to find offsets for any vegetation removed under those state requirements, independent of our restoration project. But there is an opportunity for that restoration project to contribute to our Commonwealth EPBC offset requirement, which is for the removal of 1.74 hectares of Gippsland grassy woodland. So that offset requirement is essentially 8 to 10 hectares. So there is potential for us to use our 200 hectare restoration to satisfy that much smaller 1.74 offset or 10 hectare offset. So really what we're saying here is that as the company, we're meeting all our offset requirements, but above and beyond that, we are still very much committed to putting back, this very large area of native grassy woodland, because essentially, we think it is a good thing. We want to lift the value of what can be done in a post-mining scenario. And we think it is an equally a morally defensible thing to do, a very good thing to do.
Thank you for that, Paul.
Thank you, Joseph.
Thanks for answering those questions. Look, we're going to move on now to, I'll now introduce our third specialist for the evening, Jara Mueller, and he's going to present on the surface water management.
Thanks, Joseph. So the slide coming up next. So this evening I'll be presenting on the site water balance concept, the water balance yearly variability due to climate and river flow rates, rainfall runoff, how rainfall runoff will be treated on site, freshwater offset strategy, and water management dam staging. So during the mining process, sand and clay will be excavated from a pit. The material will be moist when it is extracted due to groundwater, but more water will be required to wash the mineral content from the sand. So in this sort of diagrammatic sort of picture here, we've got an image of a blue arrow moving away from the pit towards a shed that's intended to indicate that movement of water with the excavated material into the processing plant. After washing, sand, clay, and minerals will be wet. As much water will be recovered from that wet sand as practical using sort of mechanical means such as cyclones, with that water returned to the process water dam. And that water, which is used for processing, will be recycled many times. As you can see there, we've got these sort of cyclical blue arrows moving between that shed and that dam, rectangular dam image on the screen. The minerals will be stored, back to the previous slide, thanks. The minerals will be stored prior to be transported for sale, while the excavated sand and clay would be used to backfill the pit, with under drains assisting with water capture and recycling. Some of the water contained in that material would evaporate, and some will seep into the ground and recharge the groundwater table. The water that is lost would need to be replaced. Some replacement water would be sourced from groundwater and some from the Mitchell River, and those volumes would be licensed. So the main driver for site water use is water lost to evaporation. Some other uses that are not shown on this diagram would include spraying haul roads for dust suppression, water to support the revegetation program, and a small desalination plant which will create potable water for workers. So this diagram is simplified for the purposes of the presentation. A more detailed version of the water balance, including modelling methods and sort of the volumes which are expected to move between each location and how that water balance will change through the life of the mine, is included in the concept water management report, which can be downloaded from the EES website. So that the modelling that was completed by EMM showed that the mine will need up to 3 gigalitres of water per year, with some variation between years depending on the mining rate and evaporation rates. Kalbar will obtain a Mitchell River winter fill licence, which will allow Kalbar to pump up to 25 megalitres per day from the river on days when the river is flowing at more than 1,400 megalitres per day. So only a very small portion of the river flow would be taken, and only during high flow periods, with the impact on river flow during these periods sort of being negligible in the scheme of the total flow. An analysis of stream flow and climate records was completed, with the results shown on the plot on this slide, showing that if the climate and river flows were similar to historical patterns, the Mitchell River would be able to supply the whole mine water demand in about 50% of years. So in this diagram, blue columns indicate the volume of water that the mine would be able to take from the river if the conditions were the same as they were in past years. And the black columns show the volume that would be required from groundwater. In 50% of years, the entire column is blue, indicating that that demand could be sourced from the river. In the other 50% of years, there may have been drier periods or sort of higher evaporation rates. And you can see in some years there's very large black columns, which, and those years coincide with droughts when the Mitchell River had very low flows during winter and the winter fill allocation was not available. So if those conditions were to repeat, the mine would not be able to fill up its freshwater dam from the river during those winter fill periods, and instead would be relying on groundwater through the coming summer. So this plot helps us to understand the variability of climate and river flows and how they may impact the mine. And this study has allowed Kalbar to plan for redundancy in water supply options. Next slide, thanks. So moving on to surface water quality. So to manage water quality on site, water from separate sources will be stored in separate dams. Water from the Mitchell River will be stored on site in a freshwater dam. And because that water would only be taken from the river in winter, the freshwater dam needs to be large enough to maintain the mine through summer. In the water balance modelling, the freshwater dam had a capacity of 2.2 gigalitres. Recycled water, which is moved through the processing plant, would be stored in a process water dam. This dam would be used simply for collecting water from the various processes, such as the cyclones from the under drains in the pit, and other locations where water can be collected and reused, and then sent back into the process plant. And that dam would have a much smaller volume at around 35 megalitres. Extracted groundwater would be temporarily stored in a third dam when required, This dam would be called the contingency dam. And so the water would move through that contingency dam and into the process water dam before being used in the process plant. So megalitres and gigalitres can be somewhat difficult to visualise. So a 35 megalitre dam, such as the proposed process water dam, would hold the same volume of water as the Bairnsdale Primary School Oval, flooded to 4.5 metres deep, just to give you an idea of the type of area and depth that would be required for that. And then on the next slide, we've got an illustration of similar to what the freshwater dam, could be. Sort of half the Bairnsdale racecourse flooded to 20 metres deep would give you around 2.2 gigalitres. So rain falling upstream of the site will be collected in water management dams and diverted around the site so that it remains clean and so that it can reach the downstream creeks with minimal interruption. So this means that where possible, the creeks downstream of the site would continue to receive the volumes of water that they currently receive, with minimal interruption, and maintain the natural flow regime. Between rainfall events, these water management dams would be dry. The water management dams would be constructed large enough to capture the runoff from a 1 in 100 year rainfall event, and then it would be discharged at a safe rate through the diversion infrastructure. So that 1 in 100 year rainfall event sort of volume has been selected so that the dams have a very low chance of overtopping and for flooding Kalbar's site, and to increase Kalbar's ability to control where runoff goes. Rain falling inside the site will be collected in water management dams and diverted to on-site storages. And this will prevent dirty water from entering creeks. Where possible, water would be used directly in the processing plant, which would reduce the need to pump water from groundwater or the Mitchell River. When there is more water than the plant can use, the site runoff would be treated in a dissolved air flotation plant to remove sediments and any minerals which may be attached to those sediments. And then after treatment, it would be stored in the freshwater dam. Whatever volume of rainfall runoff is captured on site, the same volume would be released to the environment at the end of the rain event from the freshwater dam. This will mean the environment receives the same volume of clean water that it currently does. But the timing of these freshwater releases would be a little different, with the released water entering the environment with some delay after the rainfall occurred. So this is called the freshwater offset strategy. Rainfall landing on the site is captured, but an equivalent amount of fresh water is released. The freshwater dam stores only water pumped from the Mitchell River and also water which has been treated through the water treatment plant, so that water released to the environment will have water quality characteristics similar to the Mitchell River. The freshwater dam would never receive processed water or groundwater, and so processed water and groundwater, which may have higher salinity, for example, would not be released from the site. So this diagram sort of illustrates how the dissolved air flotation plant would operate. So the water treatment plant used to treat site runoff would be purchased as a package from a water treatment equipment supplier. There are several suppliers in Australia who can supply plants to treat the quantity of water expected at the fingerboard site. The proposed treatment method is dissolved air flotation, which is also called DAF for short in some documents. In this treatment method, muddy site runoff is pumped from sedimentation dams and water management dams into a holding tank. Compressed air is injected into a small volume of water to pressurize it and saturate it with air. When this pressurized water is released into the holding tank, the pressure is released and the water effervesces or fizzes, releasing many small bubbles. The soil and dirt particles in the water become stuck to these bubbles due to surface tension and get dragged to the surface. And then that floating mud layer can be scraped off. So this method for treating water typically removes 95% of turbidity without the need to introduce chemicals. The resulting treated water is expected to be of equivalent quality as raw water pumped from the Mitchell River. And so for that reason, it's seen as suitable to be stored in the freshwater dam. So the mineral exists in a long deposit along a ridge. Creeks run off that ridge to the north, the east, and the south. So this diagram illustrates the general flow directions of those creeks that leave the sites. So north is at the top, the Mitchell River is at the top right, and then there's arrows indicating flow directions of each of the creeks. You'll see more detailed maps produced in GIS software in the EIS documentation. This is just a bit of a sketch to simplify things for the purpose of this presentation. So on the next slide, this slide here, you can see that only a portion of the deposit would be excavated at any one time, and the pit will move over time. And this will allow parts of the site to remain undisturbed until well into the mine life. The parts of the site which are excavated early will be closed and rehabilitated when the pit moves to a different part of the site. So when mining is complete, much of the site will already be rehabilitated. So this affects the management of water on the site, as many individual water management dams will not be needed through the whole mine life. The dams will be constructed and decommissioned as required for managing the site water. Early in the mine life, infrastructure will be constructed near the centre of the site and the pit developed nearby, and the eastern part of the site will remain undisturbed at that time. And over a period of several years, the pit will move to the east. Additional water management dams would be constructed downstream of the disturbed areas to allow the affected runoff there to be captured and treated. And as the pit reaches the most eastern parts of the site, the locations behind it will be filled with sand tails and revegetated. So whenever possible, clean rainfall runoff will be diverted around the mine workings so that the creek flows can be maintained. And that's this indicated by this black arrow. That's intended to be a creek diversion, moving from a dam capturing clean water down to the location on the other side of the pit. After mining the northern and eastern portions of the deposit, the pit will move through the southern parts of the deposit. The northern and eastern parts of the site will be rehabilitated. The dams used to manage runoff in those parts of the site would be decommissioned. And then at the completion of mining, the pit would be filled, the mine infrastructure would be removed, all of the remaining water management dams would be removed, and the landscape rehabilitated as described in the previous presentations. The final shape of the land would be slightly different afterwards in some locations due to the methods of grading and filling that are used. But in general, the reinstated landscape would be very similar to the current conditions, and each of the creeks that are currently exist on the site will be recreated afterwards. 19 surface water management dam locations have been identified. This chart shows the indicative timing that these dams would be constructed and decommissioned, showing that none of the water management dams would be required through the entire mine life. Some dams would only be used to capture and divert clean water around the site, and some would only capture mine runoff for treatment, while a small number of the dams would transition from one purpose to the other, depending on the pit location. And just in case you're wondering on that slide, it says 20 at the top. I said 19 because dam number 1 is not shown here. That's the freshwater dam in the numbering scheme that we used. So that concludes this presentation about the water management system. Joseph, thanks.
Thanks for that, Jara. Yeah, look, I've got a couple of questions here. These two came through pre the webinar, but do relate to the webinar. So the first one being, what is the volume and dimensions of the process water dam?
So the anticipated storage capacity of the process water dam is around 35 megalitres. The final dimensions of that dam will be developed during the detailed design period after approval. But this dam volume could be achieved by, for example, a dam that is 100 metres by 100 metres sort of square and 5 metres deep, or 100 metres in one direction and 200 the other, and half that depth. So the dam will have sufficient capacity to hold around 17 hours of water supply for the mine processing plant, which sort of allows the plant to keep operating in case a pump somewhere has to be maintained, that there's still sufficient water to continue running the mine. Plus an allowance above that to store the 1 in 100 year rainfall.
Thanks for that, Jara. Got one more question here for you. What is the volume and dimensions of the contingency water dam?
So in the site layout presented in the EES, the contingency dam is allocated the same footprint as the process water dam. However, the size of the contingency water dam has not yet been finalised. The final dimensions would be optimised during the detailed design based on the volumes of groundwater that are required and sort of a balance between how much water could be stored in the process water dam and the contingency dam together.
Thank you, Jara. Look, this is an EES question, but a good one. How did you use the data from your weather station to design your water management dams? So the water management dams were sized by estimating the volume of runoff that would occur during a 72-hour long 1 in 100 year rainfall event. So the Kalbar weather station only has a relatively short record available through the period that Kalbar has been active at the fingerboard site. And so the Kalbar weather station was not used to estimate what a 1 in 100 year rainfall event could look like. And it was not used directly in the dam design. The Australian Bureau of Meteorology maintains rainfall gauges at Bairnsdale and Glenullardale with long record periods. And the Bureau have analysed the entire rainfall data set collected across Australia since records began, and they've developed sets of design data for rainfall predictions which apply to each point in Australia. This data is publicly available, and using the Bureau data is best engineering practice. So the Bureau estimates of storm intensity, duration and frequency were downloaded for the fingerboard site, and the 72-hour 1 in 100 year data was used when estimating the required size of each water management dam, together with the catchment area that's upstream of those dams and rainfall runoff relationships, which are sort of applicable to mining areas and also the sort of the undisturbed grassland, sort of pasture lands that exist at the moment. Thank you for that, Jara. That's all the questions I have for yourself, Jara, but we do have a bit of time and there's a few live questions that have come through, and I'm going to throw back to Aaron Organ. We've had a question come in for yourself, Aaron. How are you going to replace hollow-bearing trees which are 120 to 400 years old into the landscape?
Yeah, look, it's a question that comes up all the time. The reality is there'll be trees removed that will have hollows, diverse range of different size hollows. You can obviously use nest boxes in some regard, but that's not necessarily going to replace what's there now and what's going to be removed. So it comes down to the significance of that loss and what species would use those hollows currently or in the future. So that's been assessed quite extensively. And the other thing too to consider is the spatial context in which those trees are located. So I mentioned before as part of the slide, one of the slides where I went through, a lot of the trees are, or the large remnant old trees are located not only in patches of vegetation and on roadsides, but also across paddocks. So there's a fewer species that would use that hollow or those hollows in those areas, as opposed to an area where it's a large consolidated patch of vegetation, say out to the west or north of this site, where you've got significant forested habitat, where you get a greater diversity of species using those hollows. So yeah, short answer is the reality is that nest boxes can only provide some level of habitat, but it's not necessarily going to replace those trees that are providing hollows and homes at the moment. And then, yeah, obviously a question comes up around the restoration and replacing those hollows, because it obviously takes many years to form hollows, hundreds to 200 years to form those. But it comes down to what species are using those and the significance of those species as part of the significant impact assessment.
Thanks for that, Aaron. While I've got you, Aaron, there is another question, another live question that's come in. So Kalbar is going to protect wildlife and return them when the works are finished. Where is the wildlife going to be transferred to while the mine is working? Is someone going to be taking care of them at an animal sanctuary?
Yeah, so highly unlikely. So when I mentioned in my presentation about salvage and relocation, it's more of an animal welfare issue. So for example, if there's an area of vegetation with fauna habitat and fauna present, then there'll be a process where ultimately those animals will be captured and relocated into another area. But look, that's just the animal welfare consideration. Ultimately, the vegetation and the habitat will be removed in the short term, but there's no proposal to do broad scale capture, keep them in captivity and then release them over time. So if hypothetically there was a number of threatened species present, then there might be more intensive capture and relocation. Good examples of recent bushfires where eastern bristlebird was salvaged and then re-released after the fires were extinguished in Far East Gippsland. So at this stage, that's not proposed, but it certainly will be undertaken on a localised scale for certain species in areas. But yeah, at the end of the day, there will be vegetation removal, and therefore there will be fauna mortality associated with that removal of habitat.
Thank you for that, Aaron. Look, I've got no more questions for yourself, Aaron, but I do have some live questions that have come in for, I'll direct these to Paul. They're related to the grassy woodlands restoration. So Paul, the question here is, what are the anticipated and or potential barriers to achieving this restoration to the level described tonight, please?
Yeah, thank you, Joseph, and thank you to the person who's asked that. It's clearly a relevant question, and to some degree my answer would be pretty much these are the sort of barriers and constraints that face this sort of restoration in general, and is potentially part of the reason why it hasn't been done at large scale. So the most fundamental one is seed. If you're wanting to restore a complex community, you need seed in quantities. We're talking, up to 50 kilos per hectare. You're needing it in quality, so it needs to be good quality seed that you're going to sow and it will germinate. You need diversity, so we're talking about putting it back together a whole community. And again, where you're working in landscapes where the communities are rare in their own right, it's very difficult to get seed. Buying it is impossible, even for the species you can buy. Native seed is very expensive. So that's, in many ways, probably the major constraint. we're trying to address that through seed production. We've found in earlier small-scale works, seed production is the fundamental way to get past that barrier, and certainly in other parts of the world, it's been incredibly important. Very large-scale seed production undertaken in Europe and in America to restore native ground layer species. The other big constraints, and these are really sort of, I'll just rattle a few off here, but markets, you know, what is going to provide the impetus to do this? In our case, it's the project itself. It provides the reason for us to go into seed production to develop budgets. Often these don't happen. Timelines, often in most restoration, in government-funded restoration, CMAs, you know, councils or whatnot wanting to do restoration, the funding periods are very short. 1 to 3 years if you're lucky. It's very hard to do something this complex, to grow seed, to pull together species, to develop the expertise in 1 to 3 years. In fact, it's essentially impossible. So with a project like this, where we've got up to 20 years to plan, to build up supplies, the restoration itself is progressive, so we're not having to do everything in one hit. We can learn as we go, we can improve our experience and what our knowledge as we go. So that would be one of the other really big constraints that I think, paradoxically, this project actually really allows us to address. At the ground level, things like weeds and soils are very, very big barriers to most restoration. But again, we've learned a lot from past projects that if you can manage weed loads and you can manage nutrients, then the native species can establish much more successfully. And in this project, where the soil is essentially removed and then replaced, we can actually replace the soil in whatever structure we want. We can modify it, we can treat the weeds, we can put nutrients down deep, and so the natives get an ideal scenario. So again, that's a major constraint to restoring complex ground layer communities. In this process, in this mining process, post-mining process, we have an ability to actually address what is often one of the biggest drawbacks. And again, I guess the last one would be expertise, capacity, equipment, and again, with the budget that we would need to do this, with the time periods, and with a program that we really do want to engage with people in the community, I think that we can develop that specific knowledge to the region. We can build up the expertise, we can build up the teams, and so over that longer time period, all those sort of constraints and barriers that normally scuttle our plans to do this sort of thing in Australia, I think we actually have a genuine opportunity to both get over and actually, show that you can do them. So thank you. That's the answer to that question. Slightly long-winded, I apologise, but that's it.
You're right, Paul. But while I've got you, I do have another live question. You're using irrigation to grow native plants for seed. Will this be necessary when using native plants for site restoration?
Yeah, well, a great question. No is the answer. Yes, absolutely. We use irrigation. We manage plants in production to sort of take away all those things that might limit seed production in the wild. So, we do all those things. But in the restoration, because we're doing these things at large scale, effectively we're talking about 80 hectares a year, we're just seeding. We're using seed from the region, essentially the genetic material of the region that has evolved to cope with, the rainfall or lack of, or conditions that we have in that area. And we sow a lot of seed. So again, not everything survives by all means, but we put enough into the ground that the seedlings develop. And the other really good thing about seed, as opposed to planting, is that if the conditions aren't right for germination, the seed is cued not to germinate until those conditions actually do arrive. So we don't need to irrigate. That's something that we've learned from restorations. And all those early slides I showed of, these wonderful grasslands that are 10, 15 years old now, these restored ones, all of those were direct seeded, none of them were irrigated. And that would not be possible if we tried to plant all those species, because again, many people know that planting, one of the things that often limits the success of planting restoration is if it doesn't rain for the next 12 months, everything drops dead. So the smaller number of trees and plants we're putting in, possibly if they need a bit of irrigation, that's feasible. But on the broad areas where we're direct seeding, they're going to look after themselves.
Thanks for that, Paul. I've got one more question for you, a live question that's come in. What is FORB? F-O-R-B.
Yeah, what is it for? Look, I'm sorry, I got a bit nerdy there. In our field, people use different terms for different sorts of plants. It's a bit like species names and common names. But generally speaking, when people talk about plant communities, they talk about trees, shrubs, grasses, and the stuff that's left over, wildflowers, lilies, things that creep along the ground, we generally describe them as forbs. So they're typically things that produce flowers, pretty little things. It's a sort of a technical thing, but if you think it in that way, essentially that's it. It's not a grass, it's not a tree, it's not a shrub, it's probably a forb.
Thanks for that, Paul. Look, I do have a couple more questions, live questions, and just sort of flagging that we will go over time a little bit, but it'd be good to cover these questions off. So Jara, a couple more for you. First one being, can the modelling demonstrate that climate-related changes have been accounted for over forward years? So increased extreme weather events, less rain, more wind. Can you explain how this has been done?
Yes, so a climate change assessment was included in the modelling completed by EMM. There were two reports which we reviewed: the guidelines for assessing the impact of climate change on water supplies in Victoria, which is a DELP guideline from 2016, and the Southern Slopes Cluster Report from the CSIRO. And these reports describe increases in average temperature with hotter and more frequent hot days and fewer frost days, decline in annual rainfall with more time spent in drought, with the greatest rainfall reductions in winter and spring. However, heavy rainfall events are expected to increase in intensity, and potential evapotranspiration increasing in all seasons, with the largest relative increases in winter and spring. So the data from those reports was sort of collated and particular climate scenarios selected. So the climate models and the sort of technical details are referenced in the Conceptual Surface Water Management report, which is part of the EES documentation. But the ultimate parameters used for looking at the sort of the end of mining, which occurs sort of 15 years from now, where evaporation rates increased by 4.7%, annual rainfall totals reduced by 2.3%, Mitchell River stream flow decreased by 11%, but the daily rainfall totals for very large storms, so anything greater than between a 1 in 2 year and a 1 in 100 year, those rainfall depths were increased by 5% for each degree of warming as recommended in the DELP guidelines. So those sort of altered climate parameters were included in the models for sort of year 15 of the mine, when there's been a chance for climate change to have had some effect. Whereas the early years of mining, we did not apply any climate change parameters because it's assumed that, for example, next year is going to have sort of similar climate to this year, as far as climate goes, with obvious inter-year variability possible.
Thanks for that, Jara. I've got 2 more questions. One more for you, Jara, and then a general question which we'll answer. So Jara, where will Kalbar get water from when the Mitchell River does not meet the criteria for removal of water?
So when the Mitchell River does not meet the flow threshold for the winter fill extraction, the plan is to supplement the water supply with groundwater. The groundwater system is currently fully allocated, so access to groundwater would occur only through the purchase of existing licenses. So this means that the total volume of groundwater extracted from the aquifer would remain the same as current levels. But those purchases, yeah, they'll be arranged in the future post-approval.
Thank you for that, Jarrah. So I've got a general question here, which I'll read out. Whilst many risks noted in the EES state unlikely, this does not equate to impossible. I'm interested to know the type of response, not mitigation, program from Kalbar if the unlikely does happen. A specific example is if surface water and/or surface water runoff and dust has a major impact on the horticultural growers in the area, which negatively impacts the strong, clean, green, trusted provenance image. How will Kalbar respond to this and what actions will they take? Noting again, not prior mitigation actions to reduce risk, but response should the risk actually occur. Actually, I'll invite Victor Hugo to answer that question for us.
Good evening, Joseph. Yeah, look, a good question. I'll say a few comments initially. So, yeah, risk is a combination of likelihood and consequence, and management is designed to reduce either or both of those in order to reduce the risk. That means that risk is never completely removed, and a risk event can occur. And I think what this question is alluding to is what is Kalbar going to do if there is, for example, a contamination event. I'd say two things. Firstly, Kalbar, as part of the EES and ongoing basically operations, is undertaking extensive baseline monitoring. So we are monitoring water quality, we want monitoring air quality, dust deposition, for example, around the site. We are monitoring soils. So at the end of the day, we will have a fairly extensive database which says, prior to mining, these were the conditions that exist. And obviously during mining, we will continue to do that, and we will be able to determine what changes are occurring, whether it's to water quality or air quality, etc. And that's important because in the event that there is, let's say, a contamination event of the horticulture industry, the first thing that needs to be established is where has that contamination event occurred or come from. So is that a direct result of something that Kalbar has done, or is that something that is a result of a more general event? So as people well know, in that part of the world, you do get days where you get extensive dust storms, and therefore dust landing on vegetables. So having that baseline data and being able to ascertain, was Kalbar responsible, I think is the first important question. And obviously then, if Kalbar is responsible for contamination, or I would say even, we're going to be doing extensive and continuous air quality modeling and noise modeling. So any excursion that we have, regardless of a contamination event, we will have to investigate and determine why that has occurred. But if there is a contamination event and it is determined that Kalbar is responsible, then we will have to deal with the landowner whose land is contaminated for whatever reason, and ensure that at the end of the day there's adequate compensation. So I think that's the kind of long answer to that question is we will ensure that we are monitoring changes. We will be able to ascertain whether we are responsible, and if we are, then we will obviously, I'm pretty sure, make good. Thanks, Joseph.
Thanks for that, Victor. Appreciate that. Look, that's the last of the questions. There's no more that have come through. Just to, I guess, we did say at the beginning that all of the questions and any more that do come in post the webinar will be answered on the Q&A and posted live in 7 days from now. So we'll now move on to how to make a submission on the fingerboards project EES, which you'll see on the screen there. So how to make a submission. Community members and organisations are invited to make a submission on the Environment Effects Statement, the draft Planning Scheme Amendment and draft Works Approval Application. So each submission will be treated as a submission on the EES and all of the related documents. So submissions must be made in writing, in online or letter form, and received by no later than 5 p.m. on Thursday, the 29th of October, 2020. You'll see on your screen that online submissions are preferred. They can be lodged via the Victorian Government's website. Hard copy submissions must be accompanied by a cover sheet. Again, details are on the screen. There are a number of stipulations relating to submissions, and these are listed on the screen now. All submissions need to identify who is making the submission and provide the address of the submitter. If a submission is made by 2 or more people, including an organisation, the name and address of the spokesperson must be provided. So that is the person who will speak to the submission in a public hearing and be the main contact person for the submission. If a submission is made anonymously, it will not be considered. Please also note that all submissions will be treated as a public document. On the screen now are contact details if you wish to get more information about the EES submission process or about public hearings. There are multiple channels from where you can find out more information about making a submission, either from Planning Panels Victoria, their website, or their telephone number, or from Kalbar directly via our Fingerboards project website, or our contact, our office number, which is a free call number that you'll see on the screen. In terms of who reads your submission, the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning independently manages the EES submission process. An Inquiry and Advisory Committee, or IAC, and the Minister for Planning consider all submissions through the EES assessment process. To specify the scope of the inquiry, the Minister for Planning will issue terms of reference to the IAC, and the IAC considers the EES, the draft planning scheme amendment, the draft work plan, and all public submissions. We're near the end of tonight's webinar. I would like to now run through the next steps of the EES process before closing tonight's session. So on the screen now, you'll see a diagram showing where we are in the EES process. So public exhibition closes on the 29th of October, and the next step is the public inquiry. The EES is on public exhibition for 40 business days. Once submissions close, an independent Inquiry and Advisory Committee, or the IAC, appointed by the Minister for Planning, will review all of the submissions. A directions hearing will be held on Monday, the 14th of December, 2020. And then the panel review hearing will commence on Monday, the 1st of February, 2021. It's possible that COVID-19 restrictions will still be in effect at the time of the hearing, so the IAC may facilitate the hearings via video conferencing technology. You can visit the Engage Victoria website, where updates and hearing timetables will be published. Following the panel review hearings and towards the end of the EES process, the IAC will make a recommendation to the Minister for Planning. The Minister will assess the environmental effects of the fingerboards project and may conclude one of the following: that the project will have acceptable environmental effects, will have unacceptable environmental effects, or needs modification to or additional environmental performance requirements to achieve acceptable outcomes. The Minister's assessment will inform other government decision makers on the approvals required for the fingerboards project to proceed. We have now come to the end of the webinar. Thank you for joining us this evening and for the questions that have been submitted. I'd like to thank our technical experts, Aaron Organ, Paul Gibson-Roy, and Jara Mueller for presenting and answering questions. A copy of this live stream will be published on the Fingerboards website and YouTube channel. As mentioned earlier, all questions will be answered and published on our website in 7 days. Thank you again for attending, and good night.